Hello and welcome to an emergency edition of On the Whistle. We are finally back with what we hope is almost an end to Sunderland's head coach search. Thanks so much for sending all your questions in. We are of course here to talk about Régis Le Bris. Now I'm hoping that that's answered one of the questions that I got the most from you, which was how you pronounce his name. I do have a GCSE in French, but that was a long time ago. As you can see from my hairline, it's a long time since I was doing GCSEs. But I think Régis Le Bris is a pretty good starting point. I will, when we finally meet the man, which we hopefully will fairly soon, I will give you an update on the pronunciation, but I think that's a decent starting point. Listen, I don't know exactly where the sort of appointment will be by the time you watch this video. If you're watching it later tonight on Friday or over the weekend, it may have been their significant developments, but what we know at this stage is that Sunderland have been in talks now for a couple of weeks with Le Bris and with his current club, FC Lorient. He is now kind of expected to take the job, but the deal is not done. There will obviously be a fee to bring him to Sunderland. He's also got to sort of negotiate his exit, of course. There's also been some hurdles in terms of work permits and just the general documentation that you need to actually move to come and work to the UK post-Brexit. It seems as if all of that is very close to a resolution now. You know, we do this video with the obvious caveat, as I always say, that nothing is done until it's done. And you never know how things are going to play out. But we know with a fair degree of certainty that at this stage, Le Bris is the man that Sunderland want. And if everything goes smoothly, he'll be appointed as the next head coach ahead of the players returning for pre-season in a couple of weeks' time. Now, obviously, it's a huge sort of step into the unknown for Sunderland, and a lot of you have sent in your questions. Some of them I can definitely answer and some of them I definitely can't, because like all of you, you know, Le Bris is not a name that I'm hugely familiar with, but hopefully I can give you some insight into how the appointment played out, why they've gone with Le Bris, why he wants the job, and also maybe a little bit of context on what can come next. So I'm just going to take a sip of my coffee and then we will get started. So the most obvious sort of question, and the one that most of you sent in, was basically, who is he and what's his track record? Well, Le Bris retired pretty early from professional football to move into coaching, and he then spent a long time in youth development, basically in academies in France. So he worked for a long time at Stade Rennais. He also worked for a long time in Lorient's academy, initially as head of academy and then as the reserves coach. He was then promoted to the top job at Lorient ahead of the 22-23 campaign. They just finished 16th, so they'd narrowly avoided relegation from the top division in France, and they had an excellent season. They finished 10th. They haven't got one of the smallest budgets in the league, but that was then still seen as a big overachievement. It was a really successful campaign, I think, in everybody's eyes. At that point, Le Bris had a lot of interest. Nice, who were looking for a new manager, were really keen on appointing him, and I believe, you know, fairly lengthy talks were held. But ultimately, I think there was a disagreement, or they couldn't come to an agreement on compensation, and therefore, you know, he ended up staying at Lorient for another season. That season was, by all accounts, a little bit of a disaster for the club more generally. They ultimately were relegated. That wasn't expected, and I think that came as a big surprise in French football circles. And so obviously, Sunderland fans will be looking at it and saying, well, hang on, why is Sunderland going and appointing somebody who's just been relegated in their most recent job? Which I think is a totally fair question, and obviously it'll be on Le Bris to prove his credentials, I guess. From Sunderland's perspective, their view very much is that there were mitigating circumstances for that relegation. Some key players were sold, and I think they feel that the strength of his work up until that point, up until this season and the season he'd had previously, means there's potentially a bit of an opportunity for them to recruit someone who last summer, for example, you know, would have been outside of their reach, really, because of some of the calibers of club that were interested in him. You know, that's the sort of the optimistic view, I guess, and that's certainly Sunderland's view. But that's hopefully a little bit of background on Le Bris, which gives you some insight. I think the big things to point out there are the obvious reasons why Sunderland are keen on him is his track record in youth development. So I'm just going to sort of follow on from that, move into another question from Elliot. Thanks for sending this in, Elliot. Thanks to Keith, by the way, for that previous question. Elliot says, what makes him the right man for the job? Must be some positives, I'm sure. Yeah, for sure. Obviously, I've discussed some of the potential negatives. He only has 2 seasons as a head coach in senior football, never managed in the Championship before. So there's 2 big sort of question marks before we move on. Then you take into factor the relegation from last season. The positives is his track record in youth development. You know, France has an outstanding record for developing young players. I don't think you work in top league academies for that amount of time unless you're a good coach and you have a good record of developing players. You know, Matteo Guendouzi and Ilan Meslier, the Leeds goalkeeper, they both came through Lorient's academy. So I feel that's probably one of the things that's initially marked him out as, you know, one of the prime candidates for the role. The fact that he overachieved so much in his first season against his budget will also be something that attracted Sunderland to the job. So I feel like those are the kind of the key qualities that have brought him sort of into contention. Sunderland also feel that his playing style is going to be a good fit. As you can imagine, really difficult for me to make a judgment on that, having not seen his side, but that's certainly something that we'll keep a close eye on going forward. So I know that's quite a brief answer, Elliot, but hopefully that gives you a bit of insight into a couple of the things that I think, you know, have sort of attracted him to Sunderland. Loads of you have asked, does he speak English? Which is a really interesting question. Obviously, I don't know that entirely at this point, but I'm told his English is really impressive for somebody who's never worked outside of France. So while I don't think it is, I think it's possible that Sunderland would have appointed someone who had sort of not great English if they felt his work, his coaching was strong enough, if they felt that he could, you know, the positives of appointing him outweighed the negatives. And of course, it's a very diverse dressing room now at Sunderland, but I'm told that his English is actually really good. And that was definitely something that sort of lifted him up the pecking order, if you like, the fact that they feel he's going to be able to communicate really well with the entirety of the dressing room. And hopefully, obviously, that means, I do think it's important because it will help him communicate not just with us in the media, but also you supporters as well. You know, that was something which was Tony Mowbray was fantastic at, Alex Neil was fantastic at, Michael Beale struggled with, albeit in difficult circumstances. So I think that's really important. Just on that, you know, I think that ultimately I do get the impression that there was a recognition that maybe they didn't take that into consideration, the importance of that communication and leadership enough with Michael Beale. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Le Bris copes with the sort of quite, let's be honest, there's, you know, only 6 or 7 clubs outside of, if even that many outside of the Premier League with the intensity that Sunderland has. You know, Leeds United's an obvious one, but there's only a handful. And so that's going to be a big factor moving forward, and fingers crossed, you know, his English does turn out to be good and he can be a good communicator. But from what I hear, that's not something to be overly concerned about. It is definitely seems to be something that hopefully we'll see he's got a really good command of. So one of the questions was about his sort of playing style and his qualities and formation as a head coach. And from what I can gather, his formation seems to be quite fluid. He played with a back three a lot last season, which is kind of interesting because obviously, although Mike Dodds did it at times, it's not something Sunderland did particularly regularly. But he seems like he's someone who's quite flexible. The previous season, when they finished 10th, they had some really talented wingers who did an excellent job. Dango Utara moved to Bournemouth. He was actually one of the players that I think was most missed for Lorient last season. So I think he'll be quite versatile in terms of formations. The one thing that definitely seems to come through from his time in France and his time in charge of Lorient is they were quite a counter-attacking team. More often than not, the opposition had more of the ball than they did. It seems to be that, yeah, he wants to attack quickly when Sunderland get the ball. That's going to be really interesting to see how that develops. Is that because he felt that was the best way to succeed with Lorient, especially in a relegation battle last year, or is that indicative of how he actually wants to play in any circumstance? We know that Sunderland are a team who want to dominate the ball, but we also know that they want to play a really high pressing style, a really intense style. And so maybe that kind of counter-attacking style is something that will actually blend quite well with Sunderland. But this is going to be a really interesting thing for me moving forward, and something that I'm definitely going to be judging the club hierarchy sort of against, because, you know, one of the things, all this talk about the front foot playing style, the fearless style, being bold, creative with this young team, we had most of that under Tony Mowbray. I know there are frustrations with players, you know, with the issues in the final third at times, but that was a great team to watch. And it was just utterly bizarre to me that we went to Beale, whose focus seemed initially to be on tightening up the defence, and the football got significantly worse to watch in my eyes. And that was really interesting to me, because I thought, well, what were you talking about in the interview process? How come there was such a misalignment between what you said you were going to produce and what actually happened? And so it'll be really interesting to me to see whether we see that alignment and whether we see Le Bris, you know, move to a more aggressive playing style. I don't think it's all necessarily about having the ball, having 60-70% of the ball. I actually think Sunderland's a fan base where I don't think you necessarily have to play tiki-taka. I think there are a lot of Sunderland fans who want to see the ball played forward quickly, who want a real intensity of their approach. So per se, I don't think there's necessarily an issue with a counter-attacking style or a more direct style in possession, but it does have to be attacking, and it does have to be quite bold and quite brave. To be honest, I think it'll have to be with the players that are already in the squad and who Sunderland are going to sign this summer anyway. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question a little bit, but let's be frank, it's going to be a little bit, we're going to find that out as we go along. Excuse me while I have another drink, and then I'm going to go through another few of your questions. So this is a really good question from John Ridley. Thanks, John, for sending them in. Does this show we don't really have an ongoing plan for when managers leave? It's taken too long in my opinion and can't have been first choice. You will 100% get my backing though. I think it's a really good question, John. I think that obviously succession planning is something that Sunderland have talked about a lot and something that they're quite proud of and believe in. I do agree with you to an extent. I think that my main frustration with I think everybody had their own opinions on Tony Mowbray, whether it was the right time, whether the issues in the final third and with the strikers were his fault or the players' fault or the recruitment's fault. Wherever you stood on it, that timing of that departure made no sense, because it was clear that Sunderland didn't have a successor lined up. Their favoured candidates at that time, they either couldn't get out of their jobs or they didn't want to leave their current jobs in mid-season. So that then begged the obvious question, why did you do it at that time? Especially when, whatever you say about Mowbray and where the team was, they were still in the playoff hunt, and their performances, the performance data, which Sunderland say they put a lot of store in, is generally pretty good. So all of that together told me, and the fact that they ended up with Beale, that they'd made quite an impulsive, or somebody at the club had made quite an impulsive decision to sack Mowbray, rather than it being really well thought out, really well considered, an evidence-based decision. And so when you then go through a process where it takes over 120 days to get the successor for the next job, I think it's natural to wonder whether the succession plan is as strong as it should have been. I'll say a couple of things on this, just I think to put a little bit of context around it. The first thing is that my understanding is that actually the search for a new head coach didn't really begin until April, the start of April, because after Beale left, the club took a conscious decision to basically say, look, we got that wrong. That wasn't the right person for the job. Why was that? What did we get wrong? And what do we need to do next time? And from what I understand, actually the criteria for appointing a head coach was tweaked a bit to take into some of the factors. One of those is something that I've already talked about, which is in terms of understanding that Sunderland's not just like any other football club. There's unique demands and you have to have someone who's capable of coping with that. Is Le Bris the person to deal with that? That's going to be really interesting to see. I can't say that. I don't know enough about him. I haven't come across him. But that's one of the reasons why the search took so long. The other is, look, clearly everybody knows when Will Still left his previous job in May, Sunderland moved quickly to try and get him. I think that's obvious. My understanding is that Still and Le Bris were on a 5-man shortlist that was drawn up. When Still became available, they felt there was a chance there of getting a deal done for someone they really liked, that they liked last December, someone that they really rated, and they felt they could get it done and tied up. That didn't happen. It dragged on. They couldn't get a resolution, and Still ultimately went to a job with a top, League On club who'll play in the Europa Conference League next season. I think that was, whatever anyone says, I think that was quite damaging from Sunderland really for two sort of vacancies in a row to not get their top candidate. As I say, Sunderland's belief is that Le Bris is a really good alternative, that and that he was in their thinking from the start. Time will tell how strong a calibre he is. So I agree with you, John. I think that there are definitely question marks over the succession planning, and I think if this one doesn't work out, I think the calls for more widespread change are going to be pretty significant, and that's going to be pretty understandable. But hopefully my answer's also shown there is a little bit more context to why this one has taken so long. One, in that it wasn't like any other search and they gave themselves a bit of time. And the other one is the Will Still factor, which I think didn't play out how anyone anticipated. And, it clearly took quite a little bit of time out of the search as well. So it's going to be really interesting. We all had to almost accept and stomach, if you like, that dreadful end to the season on the basis that Sunderland's hope was that it would allow them to appoint a high calibre candidate in the summer that justified their faith in almost letting the season drift. Is Le Bris that high calibre of candidate? Is he going to make that awful end to the season worth it? Well, only time will tell. Hopefully he will be. So thanks for your question, John. Let me go on to another couple. So this is one that I've had in a sort of slightly couple of different ways, but I'll just kind of put them all together because it's along the same theme. One from B. Turnbull, thanks for sending this in. Another's from Stevie Mack. Basically saying that this isn't the kind of appointment that's going to get players to sign new contracts, to be excited about the future. Obviously, everybody knows that Chris Rake has a big decision to make. Dan Neil's also knocked back the initial offer of a contract extension for a few reasons, one of them being the uncertainty around the club. I'd say two things about that. One, I suspect that they're seeing this as exactly the same. I shouldn't speak for anybody really, but I would imagine that they're seeing it the same way as we are. Probably don't know a huge amount about Régis Le Bris, I should say. Sorry, I will get used to that eventually. They're probably looking at his record, seeing some good stuff, seeing some not so good stuff. The one thing I would say is that in every scenario, Sunderland are pretty well protected and that they don't have to accept bids for anyone this summer unless it's a big one. Dan Neil has 2 years left on his deal. Chris Rigg, we all know he's not signed up to a professional deal, but he's on a 2-year scholarship and he's only 1 year through it. So Sunderland don't have to sell. If someone wants to come and get Chris Rigg, they have to pay a fee. Now, obviously, if Chris Rigg makes clear that he wants to leave, you know that he could leave on a free next summer. So there's a way in which you could be forced into business because you want to cash in if a big bid's on the table and the player's clearly wants to leave. But my point is this, the players are back for pre-season later this month. There will be an opportunity for Le Bris to impress them on the coaching ground, to speak to them, to convince any player that can be part of their plans and the club's moving in the right direction. So I agree with you. I think there's definitely a concern around what's happened over the last few months, the way the season's ended. There's a question, I think, over the club's ambition. How ambitious are they going to be in the transfer market this summer? Can they convince these players that this club is still on the path to the Premier League and they can achieve that at Sunderland? All those questions are totally valid, but the one thing I would say is that Sunderland, because they've been, whatever you say about the club hierarchy, they've been pretty good at keeping players, proactively managing their contracts. So they're not under any pressure, and hopefully Le Bris can convince these players that he can lead them to a really successful season. So hopefully I've answered that a little bit. Let's see, I think I've about got through all your questions, but let's see if there are any I am missing. Yeah, one said is, this is from @Spud, who says, are SAFC close to any signings? Not sure on that one. I'd be surprised if there was anything imminent for the obvious reasons. The one thing I would say is that my understanding is that, as you know, Sunderland's structure operates and that a lot of the recruitment work goes on without the head coach, really. He only comes in at the final stages to give his input on signings and say where he sees a player fitting in, etc. So I think a lot of work has been done. The other thing I would say is that, as I sort of mentioned at the start, Le Bris has been in talks for a while. It's my understanding that the deal was in a lot of ways all but done a few days before Kirill put out that statement saying that an appointment was hopefully imminent. The reason he put out that statement was because he was confident Sunderland were pretty close to getting Le Bris. What that means is that both through the interview process and through the talks, he's been able to do a lot of planning. He's been able to look at the squad extensively. He's been able to feed his thoughts in, give his opinions on players, give his opinions on targets. So while I'm not aware of any imminent signings, I am hopeful that maybe he'll be in a position where he can come in and hit the ground running, because it does sound as if this has been in the works for a while. So I think that half answers your question. Thank you very much for sending it in. Oh, there's one here from Max who says, predict the backroom staff makeup once he's in. Well, listen, I can predict most of it. It's been pretty obvious throughout the process that Mike Dodds and Michael Proctor and Alessandro Barcarini will be staying in their roles. Sunderland believe that's really important to keep some continuity for the players, for the playing style, for the academy pathway. I will let you make your own mind up on whether it's a good thing or whether it's a bad thing. Some candidates or some people who have potentially been interested in the role clearly have been put off by that. Some candidates clearly are quite happy to work in that frame and think it's a pretty modern way of doing things. I do expect Le Bris will bring in one member of staff. I think it was obvious that should have happened with Michael Beale. He was way too isolated when he came in. I don't think that's helped with many of his issues. I don't think it helped him settle at the club. It seems like Sunderland sort of accept that, and it seems as if they're happy for any new candidate to bring one member of staff in. I don't see it going beyond that. It's one of those things that love it or hate it. I just don't think it's going to change anytime soon. I think that is about it. Thanks very much for your questions. I've got one more here actually from Ian, which I should raise, which says, who is he and why should we feel anything other than complete apathy about the potential appointment? Hopefully I've answered the first question as best I can in terms of who is he. As for your other point, listen, it's a huge step into the unknown. There's absolutely nobody can sit here and tell you that Le Bris is going to be brilliant. No one can sit here and tell you that he's going to be a complete failure. I just don't see how anyone could know how this is going to pan out. It's a huge step into the unknown. He's never managed in the Championship. He's only got a couple of seasons as a senior head coach under his belt. If you want me to say why I think you should feel something other than apathy, well, let's try and focus on some positives. He's got a good record in youth development. Hopefully that will benefit the players. He has had one really successful season in the French top tier. Hopefully he can replicate that. And I'll just throw one more in there. This seems to me like the kind of appointment that Kyril Louis-Dreyfus has seemed to want to make for quite a while. This is kind of the profile of appointment that we hoped, or sorry, I shouldn't say hoped, that we expected him to make off the back of Tony Mowbray departing. And so hopefully what I hope is that what we might finally see now that kind of appointment's been made, someone who Louis Dreyfus clearly knows, clearly likes personally, clearly rates as a head coach personally. Hopefully now that is now in place, we can see a little bit of alignment behind the scenes, because there's clearly been friction with the previous 3 head coaches at various times. Hopefully that's a bit of a thing of the past now, and hopefully something can move forward. But I'm not going to sit here and tell anyone after the way last season ended and after 123 days that, there shouldn't be any criticism or people shouldn't have concerns. It's a huge step into the unknown, but maybe that's one reason not to be apathetic. Maybe it's the start of an exciting new chapter, and one thing can be sure, it's not going to be dull, is it? We all know Sunderland well enough to know that. Thanks so much for sending your questions in. It was really nice after so long away to see that you all still remembered what On the Whistle was and still had questions for me and still wanted to get involved. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Hopefully with pre-season nearing, with pre-season friendlies coming back, with more news coming back, and we'll be able to do them a bit more regularly. I'll definitely do you one once we've actually met with Régis Le Bris and once we've hopefully spoken to Christian Speakman about the appointment when it hopefully goes through. And we can chat about a few more things then and speak a bit more about transfers and what have you. But yeah, just wanted to say thanks again so much for getting involved. And if you've watched this all the way through, thank you so much, because I know I can go on a little bit and everyone tells me off for writing too many words and speaking for too long in my answers. So thank you very much for watching. It's been great to be back doing On the Whistle and hopefully see you soon.